Welcome, everyone. I know on the leadership side, we're down quite a bit today, but I thought the worship sounded great without having a piano and most of our normal vocalists here. So just goes to show, I said this in the back this morning when the men were praying, it doesn't matter because as we know Yeshua taught, where two or more gather in his name, he's there in his midst, and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter how sweet to our own ears our worship and praise might be, and I actually thought it was really good. Doesn't matter how many. Well, all that matters is that those who have come gathered together have come together for the right reasons, with prepared hearts, and that we've come to focus on him. And so, maybe small, at least on the leadership side, but I think it still was very strong this morning. So the teaching for this morning, it's one that I've actually done in the past, so some of you may recall this, though it has been, when I looked, it's been 4 years since I last gave it, so some of you even who have heard it may not recall, but I know, we've had people join us that weren't here 4 years ago to hear, so will be new to you. But as I was sitting down last night to think about and praying to God about what I should teach upon, this teaching did come to mind, and I have to admit it was probably several things that are kind of unrelated but there are things that are occurring, whether it be here at Rosh Pinah or if it be things that are just going on out there in the world that brought it to mind. Now ultimately it's a teaching about what faith is and the type of faith that is supposed to be demonstrated by the disciples of Yeshua. And so, the title of the faith is up there, what I call the Hen-La faith. This is a term that I coined probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And the Hen-La is Hebrew, and we'll get to what that means here in a second. But it's the type of faith that each and every one of us should be demonstrating in our lives. But unfortunately, I feel, at least I think many Christians do, many followers of Yeshua do, but when we look especially on the televangelists, when we turn on the television, we look at what's being represented out there as what faith is, it kind of misses the mark. It doesn't really hit what the faith of a disciple should truly be. Now, Vehen-La is Hebrew for but if not. So this is but if not faith. And those of you who remember this teaching from 4 years ago, you may remember why I call it but if not faith. But if you were not here, or you don't remember where it comes from, this kind of gets into like I said, there was a convergence of different events going on that reminded me of this teaching and brought it to my mind. First of all, the but if not, it comes from Daniel chapter 3 in the scriptures. And since we're going through the book of Daniel at Yeshiva, we actually were reading and we were studying the story that this is attached to 2 weeks ago. So it was already present in my mind. And then as I was watching, I saw on television this week, I'm seeing commercials for movies that are out and everything. Many of you may be aware that there's a war movie that came out this weekend called Dunkirk. Actually, it looks like a really good movie if you are into those types of war movies. But if not, relates to that event. I'm really hoping that whether they explain the true meaning of it or not, I don't know if they'll take the time, but I'm actually hoping but if not actually is shown in this movie. And if they're going to be historically correct, they need to, because this is actually a key component of the Battle of Dunkirk. Because what was happening in 1940 is as the German Nazi armies were sweeping across Europe and catching all of the countries by surprise, the British troops, and there was between 300,000 to 400,000 of them stationed in France and Belgium at the time, they got caught on the shores against the sea by the German army with no evacuation route. There was no ships there to get, or at that time it wasn't the airships really developed, to get them off the land. So they send out this SOS to the British Isles And it was, all the SOS was, but if not. And so, when I heard, I saw that this movie Dunkirk was playing, and remembering that story, the but if not, and then again, having gone through the story in Daniel at Yeshiva, all this came to mind, so I thought it would be a good time to bring this teaching about again. Now, of course, most important for us this morning, more important than any movie or, even a World War II battle, is the events in Scripture from where this statement comes, and the type of faith that was displayed by those who spoke it. Now, the story is one of the more famous ones in Scripture, and most of you do know it. Those of Yeshiva, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I mentioned Daniel 3, because we just went over it. But for those who may not remember exactly, or if you haven't turned to your Bibles yet, Daniel 3, what story is there? This is the story of the events of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were the ones who proclaimed, but if not. But just, if you don't recall the full story, if you haven't read it in a while, just to give a recap of why did they state this, and what were they actually, when they were proclaiming their faith, what actually were they responding to? What we need to remember is that this was the time when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had built an idol. And it was a large idol of gold, probably about 90 feet high or so. It was out on a plain so everyone could see it. And he gave a commandment that at certain times of the day, when he would have all these musicians playing instruments, when they would strike up the music, everyone was to fall down and worship this statue. And specifically, he called all of his leaders, all of his government officials, military officials, the religious officials in the Babylonian kingdom to come before the statue and fall and worship it. And he said, if you do not do this, the punishment will be you'll be thrown into a fiery furnace. It'll be capital punishment. You will be killed by fire. And so when the time came and the music played and all of them fell down, of course, the Jews did not do this because they remained loyal to Torah and to their God. And again, we don't know if there were many Jews that were present, and they noticed that all of them didn't fall down, or if it was just the three Jewish officials, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who did not bow down to it. But when they did not, the Chaldeans and the other leaders in the government who were jealous of these Jewish officials and appointees, they of course went to the king and pointed out that they did not follow the command. As a response, Nebuchadnezzar brings Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before him. And when you read the scripture, we're not going to go through all the verses, but when you read it, it's almost like Nebuchadnezzar was almost trying to give them an out. He was trying to act, because he liked them, especially, these are the friends of Daniel, and Daniel holds a very high place in the government and has great favor with Nebuchadnezzar. It's almost like he was trying to give them out and give them a second chance, like, the command, next time it happens, let's see it occur. Let's see, you need to bow down at this golden image. Daniel 3, 13, 15 gives us somewhat of a picture of this. It says,
Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?
So when you read that, first of all, we see that Nebuchadnezzar is upset. It says he's furious with rage that his command was not followed. But at the same time, it still seems like, do you not know about the command? He's like asking them. And it's almost like he is trying to give them, again, a second chance. But regardless of whether he's giving a second chance or not, we see that Nebuchadnezzar is giving a direct challenge against the sovereignty, the authority of the true God, the God of Israel and the God of the patriarchs. And Nebuchadnezzar probably did this because in his own mind, he likely saw himself as a god or some type of demigod. After all, many of these ancient nations in the Middle East, their leaders often did see that there was some type of, they often saw in their own minds, and the people saw that they were, if they weren't gods, they were on their way to ascending into godhood. And certainly Nebuchadnezzar, at this time, being the mightiest king in all of the earth, or especially at least in the Middle East, he brings Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he questions, why is it you believe that your God would be able to rescue you out of my hands? And this attitude really it's not surprising that Nebuchadnezzar, as a pagan ruler, would think this way. Again, this was a common thought in the ancient times, and it was a common thought that if one kingdom conquered another kingdom, it was because the gods of the winning kingdom were superior. They were the greater gods. They had greater power and authority in order to do this. And so the fact that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians had subdued Jerusalem and Judea 3 times, in the pagan mind, in the pagan world, this day and age, they would have thought, well, that showed that the Babylonian gods were greater than the God of Israel, the God of Judah. And especially Nebuchadnezzar may have been feeling this way, and the scripture doesn't clearly state this. But it's interesting that there are some translations that they've inserted some dating into this time period. We don't know why all the translations don't have this. But some of the ancient translations actually place this in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, which is around the time that the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So this may have been right before, it may have been right after. That may even been, some scholars theorize that this may have been why Nebuchadnezzar even thought to build the statue. It was a way of actually celebrating his victory over Jerusalem. And so, again, in his mind, he's going to be thinking, especially if it is right after or around the fall of Jerusalem, he's going to assume, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I've just proven that I'm stronger than your God, or my gods are stronger than your God. He didn't defend Jerusalem. He didn't he didn't prevent me from taking over the land. He didn't prevent me from taking you as exiles into my kingdom. I'm the one who elevated you to great authority, not your God. This is what's going through his mind. Now, of course, we know that these thoughts, these opinions would be completely wrong, because Nebuchadnezzar failed to realize that he himself was only a mere clay vessel. He was an instrument in the hand of God to bring about judgment on the kingdom of Judah because they had broken their covenant with God. He wasn't superior to God. He was just an instrument, a temporary instrument at that. And we see evidence of that through the prophet Jeremiah, who said the following in 21:3-7.
But Jeremiah answered them, Tell Zedekiah, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I am about to turn against you the weapons of war that are in your hands, which you are using to fight the king of Babylon and the Babylonians who are outside the wall besieging you. And I will gather them inside this city. I myself will fight against you with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm, in furious anger and in great wrath. I will strike down those who live in this city, both man and beast, and they will die of a terrible plague. After that, declares the Lord, I will give Zedekiah king of Judah, his officials, and the people in this city who survived the plague, sword and famine, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and to their enemies who want to kill them. He will put them to the sword. He will show them no mercy or pity or compassion.
But even seeing, and it's not, we can't say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had heard this prophecy from Jeremiah. Most likely they didn't. By the time Jeremiah is giving that prophecy in Jerusalem to Zedekiah and the officials there, they were already in exile in Babylon. So likely they never even heard these words from Jeremiah. But it still would have been very easy, even in their own mindset, even if they truly believed that their God, the true God, was superior to the Babylonian gods, and that he was superior to the authority of Nebuchadnezzar. They still, there could have been that thought in their mind that, but obviously we've lost our favor with God. Because, yeah, God has the ability to defeat the Babylonians, but he didn't. He chose not to. In fact, he let us go into exile. You still would have thought that would have been in their mindset. And if they did have that in their mindset, and we can't say for certain whether they did or not, I think it's even more remarkable when we think about their response to Nebuchadnezzar. Because God had delivered the Jews into the hands of the Babylonians as a punishment for their wayward lives. And so their response is remarkable considering those circumstances, and it really is something we should all try to emulate. Daniel 3:16 through 17 gives their response.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand.
So the response is to say, here again, to Nebuchadnezzar, they're brought before the most powerful man, if not on the entire earth at that time, at least there in the Middle East, in the world that the Jews knew. They come before him knowing that he has it's up to him whether he's going to give this command to kill them or not. And the response is, we have no need to answer you. Basically saying, you don't have any authority over us, and we don't have to respond. We don't have to give an account for our actions to you. And of course, we know the rest of the story that occurs because they responded this way to him. And we know that they're thrown into the fiery furnace and how they're preserved in that furnace. Furnace that's heated 7 times more than normal because Nebuchadnezzar is so enraged by their response to him. The furnace was heated up so much that the flames engulfed those who threw them into the furnace. Yet they come out of it without a single singe on them, nothing burnt. In fact, the scripture says that not even the smell of fire, so the smoke of the burning, didn't even penetrate their clothes. They passed completely through it untouched. And from this story, we see how 3 men showed a great trust in the sovereignty of the Lord. We see how they proclaimed to a king who had the power of life and death over them, that they're not going to bow to his idol, because they knew that God could, maybe even would, rescue them out of his hands. At the risk of their own lives, they proclaimed that God was superior to this ruler, that was this most powerful man of this most powerful nation on the earth. And we see through the story how God rewarded them for such faith by performing a miracle and delivering them out of the fire. And this is where most readers, and many times if you've listened to sermons and messages on this is where I think most people are content to stop with this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They take comfort that God has responded to the expression of these men's faith by displaying his sovereignty over not just the Babylonian rulers, but even over the physical laws of nature. That, you throw something in fire, you expect it to burn. Well, God showed that he's even greater than those laws of nature, because after all, he's the creator of those laws of nature. And for many modern Christians and other people who read this is a story of great comfort. And it really should be, because it demonstrates the rewards of faith in the true God and his promises. But I do argue that there's even a greater demonstration of faith by these 3 men that is entirely missed if we leave their story simply as this. As simply they demonstrated faith and they were rewarded for it. What we would be missing is that demonstration of what I call the hen law faith, or but if not faith. For although they did proclaim that they proclaimed their faith in God's sovereignty over the power of Nebuchadnezzar, they actually proclaimed something even greater regarding their own faith in God. For after stating that God was able to deliver them from the furnace and the Babylonian king, they said the following in Daniel 3:18.
But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up.
Now that's the New King James, right? Yeah, so that's that but even if. So, but if not, that's what the King James translates it as. Regardless, the Behen La is what they said. But if not, so they proclaim that yes, God has authority over the earth and he will rescue. He is able to rescue us out of the fiery furnace. But then they say, but if not, but if he doesn't, they're still not going to worship his gods. These false gods. They're not going to bow to Nebuchadnezzar. After having proclaimed God's ability to rescue them, they followed up by declaring that their faithfulness to God, that their refusal to violate his commandments and worship a graven image wasn't based on their belief of being rescued. And it wasn't based on a belief that if they demonstrated enough faith towards God, that they would receive a reward, that God would have to rescue them from this threat. But rather, their faith was grounded upon something even deeper, even much greater. Their faith was founded on simply that God had given commandments, and because he was the sovereign of Israel, who had entered into a relationship with Israel, they were going to obey it. Didn't matter if they were rescued or not. They were simply going to obey it because this is what God had commanded. And in their declaration of faith, they did not view God as some entity with whom they could bargain or negotiate. And that's what, unfortunately, what I see in some Christians today, especially those who follow after like the teaching, the prosperity teachers, the name it and claim it teachers, and so on. They didn't approach God with an attitude that if I step out in faith, or if I do what's commanded, then God owes me something. Whether he owes me riches, fame, healing, a divine power, rescue from my current situation. That's not the mindset they had. Their mindset was that of, their mindset wasn't, hey God, look at me, I'm standing up in your name in front of this great king, so you have to help me out here. That's not the attitude that they were coming with. Instead, they showed a greater level of faith, a deeper level of faith to God. And that, again, they would not violate his commandments because simply it would be the wrong thing to do. It'd be the evil thing to do. It'd be the unholy thing to do. Their obedience was an acknowledgement of faith in God's holiness, in the righteousness of his commandments, in his sovereignty over all things, but even more so, it was a demonstration, it was an acknowledgement of their faith that they had a relationship with him, that God loved them, and they simply had to trust in God's love. And this is the greater faith, the faith which all of us should demonstrate, of which I referred to earlier, and what I mean by but if not faith, or lahenva faith, is a faith that allows us to say, God, I will show obedience to you, not out of fear of a fiery furnace, or even a fiery afterlife. I will show obedience to you not out of a desire to receive riches on earth or blessings in heaven, but I'm going to show obedience to you because I know you are righteous, and you desire me to be righteous as well. Now, I'm not saying that those other things may not be true consequences of your faith or a lack of faith, but that for the mature follower of Yeshua, the consequences are secondary. And what is primary, what comes first, is that I have a relationship with God. That's what I'm truly striving for. I'm not trying to avoid something. I'm not trying to receive something. I simply want to have a relationship with God, with my Creator, with my Savior. Obedience shouldn't, at that point, then be seen as a burden. It's not a burden we have to carry in order to avoid punishment. It's not a burden that we carry in order to receive blessings. Rather, the burden's lifted, and it's something we do simply because we are reacting in response to a relationship God has established with us. We are doing it because we love him, because he loved us first. As simple as it is, John 14:15 says it all.
If you love me, keep my commands.
Look what Jesus said there. He didn't say if you love me, he didn't say if you want to avoid punishment, keep my commandments. He didn't even say if you want to be blessed, keep my commandments. He simply said if you love me, keep my commandments. Your response, if you love me, your response should be obey me. Now those of you who are parents should understand this sense of love immediately. You hope your children listen to your instructions and they obey the rules that you establish. Not because you hope to avoid having to punish them, not because you want to lavish gifts and words of praise upon them when they do what you tell them to do, but you simply want your children to show obedience because they love you and they trust you. They trust you that they trust that you love them and that you have their best interest in mind at all times, and that's why you set up the rules that you do. Such a desire to see loving obedience from our children is what God desires for those who belong to him. It's a faith that rests upon the relationship between him and his creation, not a faith that relies upon negative or positive consequences of that relationship. Now, when we read from the parashah this morning at the end there, as Brian said, we finished another book of the Torah. As we go through our annual cycle of the parashot, we came to the end of the book of Numbers. Now, Numbers is an incredibly instructive book that unfortunately many Christians never take the time to read. And they're missing a lot of significant teachings in it, because throughout it we see the consequences of those who lack a faith in their relationship with God. And we see the consequences of when that relationship breaks down, because the elect who are entered into it, they fail to show this but if not faith. In fact, this consistent theme woven throughout the entire book of Numbers shows how the Hebrew name Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, is actually a better title for the book, because the wilderness experience is the direct unfortunate result of Israel's lack of faith. And it's much more important to the book than any census, which we get the English words Numbers, because there's a census taken in it. Understanding that this is the book of the wilderness. This is the wilderness experience. It's much more instructive. About a month ago, when we were going through the parashot, we read the first instance of the children of Israel's lack of faith. Having given Israel the instructions of the covenant made with the Lord at Sinai, God led them to the southern border of the land that had been promised to Abraham. And following God's instructions, Moshe sends out 12 spies to survey the land and then report to the children of Israel about what they found. We hear the report of the 10 spies in Numbers 13, 25 through 29, and 32 through 33, which says,
At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here it is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. He even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are great in size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anakim from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them.
Now, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of this report that the spies give is to recognize they didn't lie. And they actually, they weren't seeking to deceive the children of Israel in what they reported. First of all, they give a positive report about the land. They confirm it is a land that's flowing with milk and honey. It's a rich land. It can provide for us. And their comments about the inhabitants, those Canaanite tribes and nations that inhabited the land, they weren't really a fabrication. At that time, probably around the 15th century BC, the land of Canaan was filled with very strongly fortified cities, and some of these Canaanite tribes had some strong armies. So, they're giving a true report. But the problem with their report and the resulting plot by the Israelites to overthrow Moshe and return to Egypt was the lack of faith that they demonstrated, specifically that Vahen La faith. The Israelites failed to trust in the sovereignty of God and in the relationship Elohim had forged with them through the covenant at Sinai. Doubt and yearning to return to the relative safety of Egypt, at least that relative safety, even though it may have been in slavery, they knew it was something they knew. That doubt overshadowed any faith they might have in God. Ultimately, they failed to have faith, or in other words, they failed to trust the power, and perhaps even worse, they failed to trust the love that God had for them, which guaranteed his protection over them. And when you start to think about it, these were people, they had seen the Red Sea split. They had seen Egypt. Egypt was much stronger than any of the Canaanite tribes. They'd seen themselves be delivered miraculously. They'd seen the plagues in Egypt. They had seen how God, at this point for over a year, they've been living on manna from heaven. They'd seen how God provided for them. They'd seen water that was bitter turn refreshing and sweet. They'd seen the miracles. So I find it hard to believe that this was a question of were they doubting the power of God to give them victory? And so where else would the doubt lie? And you have to wonder, were they still doubting God's love for them? Were they doubting not that he could do it, but would he do it for them? Now, in contrast to this attitude among the Israelites, we have, of course, the example of Caleb and Joshua, the two spies who spoke against the advice of the other 10. And those who did demonstrate the but if not faith, which is to say, obedience to the relationship between God and Israel. The words of their faith are shown in Numbers 13:30.
Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it."
And also in Numbers 14:6-9.
Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them."
In the first of these two passages, we see that faithful zeal of Caleb to simply go out and obey God. As he heard the other spies begin to give their report of the numerous tribes that inhabited the land and their strength, he interrupts them and he calls for the Israelites to go up immediately. Like not even let's take some time, make preparations. I think we can have victory. But he says, let's just go. Let's immediately go up, take possession of the land as God's commanded. Caleb's faith in God was simply to hear his promises, hear his commands, and then respond. In the second passage, we're given even more insight as to why Caleb and Joshua possessed the faith that they did. In verse 8, it is declared that if the Lord delighted in them, he would give them the land. Again, that speaks not necessarily to their trusting the power of God, but do they trust the love of God? Do they trust that relationship that God has forged with them? Because he's saying if he delighted in them, he would give them the land. And this word delighted, in the Hebrew, chafetz, it means there is a feeling of strong positive attraction for something, a sense of affection for someone or something. So their faith that led them to obedience to possess the land rested on their belief that the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was a God with whom they not only had entered into a covenantal contract or a covenant with him, but into an actual relationship in which there was a strong sense of affection. Joshua, when he says those words, he understood God loved the children of Israel. And that it was because of that love, he would exercise the power and authority that he had. And therefore, Caleb and Joshua, they were able to obey God's commandments because they recognized the righteousness of God to keep his promises. They recognized the sovereignty of God to carry out both his promises and to protect them. And ultimately, they recognized and they acknowledged the love of God, that there was actually a desire to protect the children of Israel. Now, unfortunately, Israel did not learn quickly from the discipline that was extolled upon them because of their lack of faith and the lack of obedience, that because they yielded to the report and the advice of the other 10 spies. They would end up wandering, as we've been reading in the book of Numbers, they would end up wandering the wilderness for 40 years. And there would be a loss of 2 entire generations that left Egypt but never got to enter the promised land. And yet the Israelites would again and again fail to show that obedient faith unto God. And it would be seen because they would constantly murmur, they would constantly complain against God and against his chosen servant Moses. We see it in Korah's rebellion and the murmuring of the people who complained after those who opposed Moses were swallowed up by the earth. We see it in other instances where they murmur against God, as in Numbers 22-5 and again in 21, 4-6.
Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died.
In each of these instances, we see a lack of faith in God's promises and in his sovereignty, which are the result of a failed relationship with him. Those who murmured against the Lord not only lacked the faith to trust in God's ability to see them through the difficulties of the wilderness, but they lacked that faith that we see demonstrated by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were not able to stand and say they would remain obedient due to their relationship with the Lord, regardless of whether or not God preserved them in the wilderness wanderings. But a different story would have been written if the children of Israel in the wilderness had been able to say, "We trust that God will preserve us in the wilderness. He will take us to the land that was promised to the patriarchs. But even if he doesn't, we're still going to be obedient." And if you think about it, remember these generations that we read about the murmuring there in chapters in the 20s, they had heard, because when they rebelled with the spies report, they had heard that they weren't going to enter the land. That curse, or whether you want to call it a curse or a punishment, had already been decreed over them. So they knew they weren't getting to the land. That's why they needed that but if not faith, because they should have been able to say, but if not, even if I'm not going to go through the land, we as a people and my children have entered into a relationship with God that I know God will at least preserve that younger generation, and therefore I'm going to be obedient. Simply because I'm in a relationship with God. I love God, and in response to that love and his love to us, we will obey. Turning to the New Testament, we also see a demonstration of obedient faith that acts solely upon the recognition of who God is and our relationship with him, rather than relying upon, showing faith, relying upon an expectation of avoiding punishment or receiving rewards. We see one of the greatest examples of this actually in the Gentile centurion who asked Yeshua to heal his servant. Luke 7, 1 through 8 says the following.
When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed, for I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it."
So, in the words of the centurion to Yeshua, he demonstrated a great understanding of who Yeshua was and the authority that he possessed. He understood that because Yeshua held the authority to heal, there was no reason to doubt that he would heal, despite the traditions and the customs that separated these two men. As such, the centurion acted on this faith, reasoning that as I hold authority over others, so must Yeshua hold authority over the health even of my servant. And in response to this faith, Yeshua proclaimed the following in Luke 7, 9 through 10.
When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well.
There's also, in the New Testament, we also see other examples, but examples in the lives of the disciples and the people that interacted with Yeshua. But we also see, when we go to the book of Hebrews in chapter 11, we see how the writer of Hebrews, looking back to those men and women of the Old Testament, of the Tanakh, how they, time after time, the great heroes of faith, would demonstrate this trust in their relationship with God. In each of the instances that are given in Hebrews 11, it speaks of the individual acting because of their faith in who God is. Again, not because of an expectation of the consequences of their faith. It's simply, this is how I understand who God is, this is how I understand the relationship I have with God, and therefore they act out in obedience. Let's just look at a few of these examples. Hebrews 11, 5 through 6 states,
By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him.
So Enoch was taken by God because of his faith. And it was a faith that pleased God. And notice how the writer here of Hebrews emphasizes what Enoch's pleasing faith consisted of. Believing that God is, so that's just believing that God is who he is. And second, believing that God is a rewarder. Now the second part may sound as if genuine faith is concerned with the rewards. But notice it says that God is a rewarder, which is a faith that's centered on the nature of God. It's a faith that rests upon who God is. It's not a faith in the rewards themselves. Furthermore, it says he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him, which means if you actually, it's not of just all rewards, but simply that the reward being spoken of is that those who seek will find. Turning to another man, Hebrews 11, 8 through 10 states,
By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God.
So here we see Abraham. He responds to a command by God to leave his family, leave his country, and seek out a new land that would be his descendants' inheritance. Now again, we do see the promise of a reward attached to the obedience. But always remember, this was a reward Abraham never saw, his son Isaac never saw, his grandson Jacob never saw, that none of them saw it in their own lifetimes. What's important to recognize is that it was not the promise of a reward that prompted Abraham to act, but rather Abraham's understanding of who was commanding him. That's what led him to obedience. For it is only through such faith that we can truly understand Abraham's willingness, his willing obedience to the command that God gave him to say, sacrifice your son. The son, I've told you, will be the inheritor of the promise and the covenant. God says, sacrifice him. How does Abraham have the faith to respond to that? Well, Hebrews 11, 17 through 19 says,
By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the death.
So Abraham, having already received a promise of reward, so he receives the promise, Abraham's now tested by God. And part of that test, I believe, was to see if did his faith rest in the reward, or did it rest in the one who is going to provide the reward? And his act of willingness to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice, in doing that, he showed that he trusted in the faithfulness and the sovereignty of God. He trusted in that relationship that he had with God, which even if necessary, Abraham reasoned, because he had those promises from God. This wasn't God changing his mind. Abraham reasoned, if God's got to raise Isaac from the dead, then that's what God will do, and that's why I'll be obedient. God, that even death itself could not stop God from fulfilling the promise that he had made to Abraham. Finally, Hebrews 11, 32 through 39 says,
And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised.
So in each of these examples of the people of great faith, and through the trials that they endured, we see that what drove their faith was a trust in who God is, and that his promises would not return void, because his holiness to keep his promises, his sovereignty to carry out those promises, and most importantly, his love that he would want to carry to fulfill the promises. Even though none of these individuals that are mentioned and referenced in Hebrews 11 received the promise, by which the author of Hebrews, when he's talking about this promise, what he's referring to is none of them saw Messiah come during their lives. They still endured everything, all these persecution, all of the hardships and the tribulations, because they looked for Messiah to come. And even if not during their own lifetime, then at the appointed time in the future. And you have to wonder, was that part of what strengthened Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to say, but if not, even if God doesn't deliver us out of your hand, Nebuchadnezzar, it doesn't matter, because we know there's a promise of a coming Messiah. And we know the promise of a resurrection, and that we will see those promises that were given all the way back to our father Abraham. And therefore, regardless of what you do to us today, whatever occurs to our bodies here in the physical and the flesh, we know and we trust in our relationship with God that he will fulfill it one way or the other. All of these people, their faith allowed them to see beyond their own individual circumstances and realize that because of who God was, is, and will always be, the promise would come regardless of how God intervened in their own lives, whether he takes them out of the fiery furnace or not. And for that reason, God deserved their obedience. These examples of an obedient faith that responds directly to the nature of God and his relationship with us, rather than to the consequences of obedience, raises an important question for all of us believers today. I would be surprised if there is anyone here who has not at least once considered the question of what type of life would you live if God did not require you to be a holy people? What limits to your behavior would you observe, and how would you act towards other people if God had not given commands for his people to follow? Or what if those theologians and false teachers who claim a loving God could not condemn anyone, and therefore universal salvation belongs to all? What if they were actually correct? What would be the day-to-day consequences of such a reality? The hypothetical question put to you this morning is similar in nature. Let's say that God had given his commands to us, but there were no consequences attached to obedience or to sin. That although he showed us how to live a righteous life, he was not concerned with whether or not we actually followed them. They were just suggestions, good advice. What if there were no promises or blessings? There were no promises of curses. There's no Mount Gerizim and no Mount Ebal. What would be the result? How would you live your life? How would you treat others? What would your relationship with God be like? If this question had been at the beginning of today's message, before we looked at a faith that is able to state confidently, but if not, it would be interesting to hear the responses of our hearts. How many of us would have immediately went to the sin we struggle with the most in our lives and think about our ability to indulge in it? How many would think about that pulled pork sandwich you can't eat anymore, that plate of bacon? How many of you would have thought about being able to stay in bed on Saturday mornings? Or how many of you would have entertained even darker thoughts that strike at the very heart of loving our neighbor as ourselves? And yet, even if the first inclination of our flesh is to consider the sins in which all of a sudden we could indulge, that all of a sudden we could partake, we see these examples of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, of Caleb and Joshua, and even the centurion who sought out Yeshua. And what these examples, when we look really deep into them, what they show us is that if we love God and we honor and acknowledge who God is, that even if the blessing and the curses all of a sudden disappear, it shouldn't change our lives in any shape or form. Because we should still desire to obey God's commandments, simply because he loves us and he deserves obedience. The answer to the but if not scenario should be the very same as the answer to the original reality. It's very much like, and I think I've used this example before, but it's very much like now, I don't see myself as living under the commandments or the authority of my wife. But certainly there are things, maybe she may think differently. I don't see living under because we're an equal partnership. But there are things, obviously, that she asks me to do. Sometimes there are things she commands me to do. I know she's really asking, they just come out without phrased differently. And there are times I don't want to do them. This morning, this is a small thing, she asked me to run downstairs to the laundry to pull out some clothes that were in the dryer. I was sitting on the couch reading a book at that moment. I didn't want to do it. But of course I did it, and I did it without complaint. I did it without murmuring or anything. Why? Because I love her. It was a response to love is why I do the things she asks me to do. Even when I don't want to do them, when my flesh says no. That's how our relationship with God is supposed to be. Again, we do what he commands. You know, when we're on milk and we're taking the baby steps our first steps as followers of Yeshua. Maybe it is because we were first brought out of a fear of judgment and punishment. Or maybe that we heard a preaching about the rewards and the blessings, or maybe even a friend shared with us or someone shared with us how God had blessed them in their lives, and they're like, I want that. But as we mature in our faith and as we go deeper into our relationship with God, those things should disappear. Again, it's because God loves us. We therefore love him. And therefore when he asks us and he commands us to do things, we should respond accordingly. One last example. History's not been kind to the memory of the Sadducees. Those Jews, if you remember in Yeshua's time, who actually controlled the temple. And they consisted of a school of thought that denied the resurrection of the dead or the eternal nature of the soul. They were a group of Jews who took the Torah in the most literal sense and who did not view the rest of the Tanakh as even having the same authority as the Torah. When they read the prophets, they didn't see them as having the same authority as Torah. Now, part of the reason, and there's good reasons, the Sadducees are seen in such a bad light today is that we don't actually have any of their own original writings. We don't know what they actually said. All we have is reading and hearing what they said from the opposition. We have no opportunity to hear their own perspectives and the reasonings for what they thought in their own voice. Instead, we see them only in their opposition to the Messiah through what we read in the New Testament. Or we see what the Pharisees, their theological but also their political opponents in the days of Yeshua, we have their writings and we see what they have to say. And of course, they don't paint them in a positive light because they are your enemies. It's just like, if you want to know what Barack Obama was like as a president, if you're a historian, you're not just going to read what the Republicans and the conservative commentators had to say. Likewise, if you want to know what Donald Trump is like as a president, you just don't read what the Democrats and the liberals say. As a historian, you got to read what everybody had to say. Well, we don't have what the Sadducees said, so there's a bias. And again, there's good reasons because they did oppose Messiah. But, all that being said, I see one redeeming value in the Sadducees, even in their errors. And it doesn't make up for their errors, and it doesn't make up for their opposition to Messiah. But it should give us pause on our own spiritual lives. Even as though the Sadducees denied the resurrection, and they denied the eternal nature of the soul. They actually believed when a person died, not only did the flesh deteriorate and decay, but the soul ceased to exist at death. They believed that the spirit was extinguished just as the flesh did. these people still followed the commandments of God. At least as they understood them. They did so with great zeal. There was obviously no concern for the afterlife and the status of their souls in eternity. Likewise, there was no concern for the rewards of Olam Haba. And this suggests that to some degree they understood that obedience to God's commandments should be followed simply because of who God is as the sovereign Lord over the Jews and the relationship that he has with them that he established through the covenant at Sinai. And even more so, the covenant with Abraham. So therefore, in conclusion, the question I pose to you this morning is whether or not your faith is strong enough to lead you to obedience without any promise of reward or any fear of punishment. We should all be striving for Vahin la faith, as demonstrated by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. While we can rest our hope in deliverance from our enemies and preservation during the trials in our lives, we should strive for a greater faith that expects blessings, but is content to simply humble ourselves before God and obey his commandments. And we do this because he is worthy of such devotion and such love from us. For once we move beyond our concerns with the consequences of obedience and the consequences of rebellion, we can begin to just focus on our love for God and focus on that relationship with him that we need to be building in our lives. And we can make his commandments a matter of the heart rather than an outward concern with our position in life. It is at this moment that we as the followers of Yeshua can begin to center our efforts on nourishing our relationship with him. As John 14:21 states,
Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them.
Amen. It's our duty to praise the Master of all, to ascribe greatness to the author of creation. For he made us unlike the nations of the lands and has not placed us like the families of the earth. He has not made our portion like theirs or our lot like all their multitudes. And we bend the knee and bow and acknowledge our thanks before the King over kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. He stretches out heaven and establishes earth's foundation. The seat of his glory is in the heavens above, and the presence of his power is in the most exalted heights. He is our God, there is none other. True is our King, there is nothing beside him. As it is written in his Torah, and you shall know this day and take to your heart that the Lord, he is God in the heavens above, and on the earth below there is none other.